As you all know, we have gathered today to listen to an eminent speaker who's amidst us, and it's Speaker Paul Chandler, who will be presenting on Khalil Gibran, an unparalleled spiritual guide of our times. But before that, we will start with our representative from the Consul General of India's office, Consul Prashant K. Sona. He joined the Ministry of External in July 2004. Prior to assuming charge as consul in Houston in September 2024, he was Second Secretary in Embassy of India, Kathmandu, looking after development partnership and administration wing. In his earlier assignments, he has worked in Indian missions abroad in Kandy, Istanbul, and Ashgabat in various capacities handling administration, consular, commercial, and development cooperation, among others. In his stints in the Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, he has served in coordination, administration, and in the Office of External Affairs, Minister Mr. S. Jaishankar. Prashant K. Sona is a commerce graduate from College of Commerce, Patna. Prior to joining the service, he briefly worked in Rajya Sabha Secretariat and Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. He is married to Mrs. Atmika Sona, who is a homemaker, and they have 2 sons. He speaks Turkish, apart from English, Hindi, Maithili, and Bhojpuri. Prashant Sona, if you would please come up to the stage and share a few words. Thank you.
Very good afternoon. First of all, let me explain you, it was not me to speak here. My Consul General was to speak here to this August gathering. So I'm representing on his behalf. So it's my privilege to represent my Consul General here in front of you August gathering, and to participate and meet in person to the personality like Mr. Paul. I'm reading some of the books, and it was a desire to meet or like see the person, and it's really today that dream has been fulfilled. I really thank you, ma'am, for giving this opportunity, and I thank my CG also to become busy in something else. So I got this opportunity. So it's my privilege today to be here in this organization by the talk on the book by Mr. Paul. The writer himself is a very interesting, and the subject another interest. So it's a double, it's a square, like both are very important and very relevant in today's world. The subject on you write, Mr. Paul, and the subject on which Ms. Gibran wrote in, both are like not a natural thing. It's a out of box sort of thing. So it's really, and not everybody do this. So you have created something very unique combination, and my all the best wishes to you. You have done a lot in different capacity, and as a writer, this is one of the greatest book, and I hope it will not stop here, and you will continue to contribute and enlighten us more in different aspects with your vast experience in the development work that you are doing. I also like to thank the foundation for the nice work they are doing here, living to the true tradition of Gurudev, the universal citizen, creating a world without fragmentation. So, and this is something that today's world is required to. When we see all around, you see in Gaza, you see in Palestine, you see in Israel, you see in Ukraine. So one way we are saying we are developing, human being is being more intelligent and all. But if you see in the last 5 years, 10 years, we are using more of our muscles than the intellect. So this cycle has to be reversed sometime. And I think the organization like this, the Tagore Foundation, and the people you write are the true torch bearer of the change that will be brought today. Hopefully, it should not be late. It should be done before the damage is done beyond repair. And it's a very urgent. The Mahatma Gandhi, Tagore, and they all fought for peace. And these messages are becoming more and more relevant today. And this organization of this kind of activities will always be appreciated in the history and time to come. On behalf of myself and my consulate and Consul General of India in Houston, I wish Tagore Foundation all the best for this organization and all of their future endeavors. Thank you.
A small token of appreciation. Thank you. Thank you, Prashanti. And next, I would like to invite Dr. Ashok Desarkar to come up to the podium, and he is the founder, along with Ruma Acharya, of the Tagore Center Foundation, and he will be introducing the other dignitaries and will be thanking all the donors for their help to make this event successful. So, Ashok Desarkar. Thank you.
I'm not going to read the donor list, but you can all read that, right? Dr. Becker, you can read that. So, I don't have much to say. This whole concept is a brainchild of my wife. I only have some money. I give it to her. And so all of you know that. And the dignitaries are actually so fragmented here, it will not be possible for me to do it justice. But Paula, I'd like you to say at least one or two dignitaries that are very important to us in our mind, like Mr. Sector and all that. Just introduce to. So there is one here, Mr. Sector is one. Then I should mention one person which has become important in our life in the last 6 months. And that's this guy. So he's a doctor. What is your friend? Lipo? He's missing in action? Okay, so Dr. Lipo and Dr. Montero are the two doctors that saved Ruma's life. And of course, Paul, thanks for coming. And it's like the Consul General just said, there's more need for such people like you who will portray this image of peaceful coexistence rather than killing each other. And I don't know how to do that, but I guess Ruma and her family are trying to do the best they can. But there must be a way to do this. And one of the ways I keep thinking, and there's a lady sitting there next to me, yesterday I talked to you, she's doing something interesting. She's into a leadership, some kind of a course, right? Program. So maybe we all sit down together and take money from Max, who is my business partner, and his wife. Max has plenty of money, so he gives all his money to me, and his wife, right? Kathy? Yeah. I'm serious, I'm not kidding. Every couple of months, he sends me a big check, and my son keeps writing, what is this money for? He makes a lot of money, and we invest in his company, but we need to use this kind of money that we make for a purpose like your purpose. So I told her yesterday that maybe we ought to sit down, Max, and put together in the leadership course is this kind of universalism concept to the leaders, that we can tell them what we are thinking. Maybe they'll think it is them that can change the world, is what I was thinking. The another one is the State Department students that go to George Washington, Rice, Texas A&M. Students like that, we offer them a course, and we pay for it. That's not a problem. And try to tell them how to do this kind of stuff. So what Ruma has done, and practically how it is tactic in life. You can have a vision, but tactic, the devil is in the detail. And that's what we should do, some of these things. So Paul, you don't realize, but you're stuck with me now. So Max's money, your school, and Paul's philosophical idea. We ought to put together something, Paul. I'm dead serious. Yeah. And we maybe to help the world. Okay, anything else I should say? Bill? Have I said enough?
Sounds good to me, sure.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you all.
Thank you, Ashokda. Now we will have Dr. Ruma Acharya, founder and president of TCF, She will be welcoming all the attendees and thanking donors for their contribution to make this event a success. So the TCF complex architectural rendition will be presented with a video to make the audiences more familiar with our complex and our future plans.
I'm so glad to be with you again. I didn't expect, but I'm here. And I'm thankful to God and my two doctors and my husband. I'm going to give you a little story how my sickness started. As a normal person, I went to a podiatrist to show my ingrown toenail. He took the toenail out and that created some wound, and wound was not healing. So we went doctor to doctors. After 8 doctors, we found out this is not a podiatric problem, this is a vascular problem. I had to be hospitalized immediately. My chance of survival was 0%. I told my husband, take care, I got to go. My husband told me with lots of tears, I won't let you go. So that's how his journey started. He needed a good doctors and good hospitals and good medicines. In one evening, 8 o'clock, we found Dr. Montero Baker. He took my case courageously and told me he will take care of me as his family member. Now I have adopted him. He is my all-time hero. And so his partner, Dr. Brian Lippo. He is invited, but I don't see him here, but my thanks go to him. Anyway, next, I'm going to show you my dream. Here is a little video. Many of you are probably curious what these 15 acres do, and this is my dreamland. So. Exposed to the world. So let me read what our initiatives are. Our initiatives are designed to foster dialogue, understanding, and collaboration across diverse communities. We invite you to join us in our mission to celebrate diversity and inspire unity. Your participation is crucial to the success of our endeavors. Together, we can continue to build a world that embraces the rich tapestry of human experience and fosters a sense of belonging for all. Thank you. Paula to introduce our speaker of the day.
You can see from these three buildings what Ruma's dream is. So we have a lot of work to do, and we hope you'll all be with us as we complete this work. And I'm privileged to have the opportunity of introducing our speaker today, Canon Paul Chandler. He is going to do our 2024 Tagore lecture. And I'm going to read this because his credentials are extensive. He's an author, art curator, nonprofit executive, interfaith peacemaker, and an authority on the Middle East, Africa, and the Abrahamic spiritual traditions. He grew up in Senegal, West Africa, and has lived and worked extensively around the world as a senior leadership roles within the faith-based publishings, the arts, relief and development, and the Anglican Communion. He's the founding president of Caravan, which is an international art nonprofit that uses the arts for transformational purposes. He's recognized as a global leader and is using art to further our quest for a more harmonious future, both with each other and the earth. He was awarded by the Archbishop of Canterbury the Hubert Walter Award for Reconciliation and Interfaith Cooperation, which is the highest international award for outstanding service in the work of reconciliation, for reconciliation and interfaith dialogue within the Anglican community. He's a canon of All Saints Cathedral in Cairo, Egypt. He's also author of 4 books, one including the most recent one, In Search of a Prophet, which is a spiritual journey of Khalil Gibran and focuses on the all-embracing spirituality of the 20th century Lebanese-born poet, artist Khalil Gibran. He's often best known as the author of The Prophet. His book is for sale today, and he's will be signing the copies after his presentation. In addition to being a fan of Khalil Gibran, who's often referred to in his lifetime as the Tagore of the Middle East, Paul is deeply values the life and writings of Gibran himself, Tagore himself. He's even visited Shantikatikian, which is the peace village of Tagore in West Bengal twice. His presentation this afternoon is entitled Khalil Gibran, an unparalleled spiritual guide for our times. After the presentation, we'll have questions and answers, and I believe there are cards on your table if you can write your questions down. So welcome, Paul.
And I want to thank you for coming out on a Saturday afternoon, no less, to hear a little bit about someone who I think is not only one of the most profound figures to have lived in the last century, but who I think is increasingly, exceedingly relevant for our times. Someone who was an immigrant and ended up very much a prophetic voice during his own lifetime, and whose words I think are even more timely today. Khalil Gibran, the early 20th century Lebanese-American poet, artist, and mystic, and usually best known, at least in the West, as the author of The Prophet. I'm curious just how many of you, in one way or another, have encountered the prophet in your life? Directly or indirectly? Raise it high, I'm just curious. And it's usually that way when I speak about Gibran. We've even got one here that brought their own. It's interesting when I go around and speak, often people will come up and say, especially younger people, and they'll say, my grandmother gave me this, and it's up in my library. They may not have read it yet, but they knew it was kind of a sacred text that they're supposed to keep and not give away in one way or another. It's a real privilege for me to actually speak about Gibran here at the Tagore Center because Gibran and Tagore were both giants. They were also guides. And they were also literary contemporaries, and the parallels are tremendous. Both were from the East and used Eastern creativity to communicate their wisdom. Both actually decided to speak the language of their Western audience in addressing them, English. Both were from countries that were under foreign occupation at that time. Both of them had seen suffering and experienced great pain, both personally and of their people. Both gave us a message of hope and peace and freedom and enlightenment. They complemented and really completed each other, albeit sometimes unknowingly. Most of all, they had a common universal vision of humanity. Pretty much everything I share about Gibran this afternoon could also be said about Tagore. Sometimes one who lived long ago becomes seemingly even more relevant than during their own day. For our times, it's happened, for example, to George Orwell not too long ago in Western culture. And more than ever, I think there's a need to hear voices that call us to unity and respect and to be inspired to live deeply and generously in our thinking and our actions toward the other, whomever the other is. And I believe Khalil Gibran is just that voice, and his profound insights offer our day much needed wisdom and guidance. It all started for me when I was living in the Middle East. I was struck by how enthusiastically Khalil Gibran was loved and respected both throughout the Middle East and in much of the West. The East was proud of him, and the West admired him. He was very much this uniting figure. And it intrigued me to look more deeply, not just into his life and work, but also into his spiritual development, if you will, his inner journey. And I came to discover that Khalil Gibran is really a supreme East-West figure, and as a result can be an unparalleled guide, even an unparalleled spiritual guide for our times, related to peace, related to harmony, certainly related to the building of bridges between those of diverse backgrounds. It echoes Tagore, of course, who wrote, "I realized that my mission was to make the meeting of the East and West fruitful in truth." And Gibran's life and approach and work touches on so many of the issues that are critical today. A bridge for us between creeds and cultures, yes, but also care for the environment, equality for women, interest in spirituality as opposed to religion, immigration, the status of refugees, conflict in the Middle East, the inclusive embrace of those of different faiths and actually learning from the best in each tradition. And the list goes on and on and on, of course. And perhaps most importantly, he touches on a spiritual depth that so many of us crave and long for. On the crisis in Lebanon during his time, he wrote, "My heart burns for Lebanon. Fate has been most cruel to her. Her gods are dead, and her children left her to seek bread in faraway lands. And yet she's still alive. And that's the most painful thing." Could have been written yesterday. As it was said about Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Sufi mystic, poet, and scholar, he is a man for this time because he has his foot in every camp. And I wanted to delve more deeply into his inner spiritual formation and immerse myself in his writings and the environments that shaped him. And more specifically, I sought to understand what led him from being someone who was born into, at that time, a sectarian and intolerant and exclusive historic Christian community, to becoming someone who embraced everyone in our world, and as a result ended up being embraced by all. It took me all over the world, to museums, to art galleries, to churches, to synagogues, to mosques, through revolutions, through counter-revolutions. The first involved over the course of several years, visiting all the places that he lived, and taking Khalil with me, so to speak, taking his writings and reading everything he wrote in the place that he wrote them in the order that he wrote them in, during each respective phase of his life. It also led me to the far-reaching places of influence that his writings and art have traveled. And I began in his birthplace village high up in the snowy mountains of Lebanon, a little village called Bishari, and then on to Boston, where he and his family immigrated, to Paris, where he did his art training, to New York, where he spent most of his career, ending up in Mexico City, of all places, at the spectacular Museo Sumaya, where the largest collection of Khalil's writings and art exist in the Western Hemisphere. And so many places in between, where monuments and streets and schools and parks, etc., are named after him. And it didn't take me long to realize that I knew a lot less about Khalil than I had imagined. I knew he was Lebanese. I knew he was of Christian background, though I must admit when I was very young growing up in Senegal, I actually thought he might be from Muslim background. I knew that he had lived in the early 1900s, and I knew he had written that best-selling book of prose poetry, The Prophet. However, what I didn't know was far greater. I didn't know that Khalil is one of the most widely read poets in history, behind only Shakespeare and Lao Tzu. I didn't know that Elvis Presley and Johnny Cash, no doubt, no less, were among his greatest fans and gave away thousands of copies of The Prophet. Elvis had completely memorized it, and you could just open it up at any page and he could continue on and recite the rest of the book. And he gave away it to almost everyone who he thought was interested in the deeper spiritual journey. Actually, before he died, he had plans for a major film that would have been produced on the Prophet. I didn't know that he was a friend of the U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt and his family. I didn't know that he was sought out by the Irish poet William Butler Yeats to have his portrait drawn by him. I didn't know that he knew and drew the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung and the Indian Nobel Prize laureate Rabindranath Tagore. He met Tagore twice on Tagore's trips to the United States. Both times it was in New York City. The first time was in 1916. And the second time, and he was very moved by his meeting with Tagore, was in 1920, the second time. After the second time, in 1920, he painted this portrait of Tagore. And it was during a period of his life where he started actually using color. Before that, it had largely been ink or pencil drawings in that regard. I didn't know that Gibran also met Auguste Rodin, the great French sculptor, while studying art in France. And while he was in Paris, some of the great Impressionist artists were actually still around: Monet, Renoir, Degas, Marie Cassatt. And Picasso was even around then. And Marc Chagall moved to Paris while Gibran was living there. I didn't know that the morning after the Titanic sank, when he had obviously been troubled and unable to sleep, he struggled to know whether he should cancel his appointment to draw the portrait of the leader of the Baha'i faith at that time, Abdul Baha. He decided to go ahead with the sitting, and it was a transformational experience for Gibran. He was greatly moved by Abdul Baha's calming, profound spiritual presence. I didn't know, more humorously, that during the height of the American prohibition against alcohol, Khalil, with his proclivity to Arak, that Levantine anise-flavored alcoholic drink, was able to secure a continuing flowing stash of the contraband somehow. I didn't know that Queen Noor of Jordan was influenced by Khalil's work at a young age and is an avid promoter of his writings, as are the actors Salma Hayek and Liam Neeson. I didn't know that Khalil was almost excommunicated by his own Maronite Catholic Church as a heretic for his early attacks on the religious hypocrisy that he saw in it. And yet, paradoxically, at the end of his life, during his funeral at the cathedral in Beirut, he was honored by the Maronite Patriarch and other church authorities in Lebanon, as well as from leaders of other faiths from all over the world. I didn't know that Khalil's writings were instrumental in sparking a reformation and renaissance of Arabic literature, as he broke with those rigid Arabic literary canons of his day, and that through his prose poetry developed a new genre in Arabic literature. Similarly, It's what Tagore did. By rejecting conventional linguistic models based on classical Sanskrit, Tagore modernized Bengali literature. I didn't realize that Gibran, or Khalil, was seen as a political revolutionary early on in his life, speaking out through his writings against the injustices of the Ottoman Empire in Lebanon, which was termed Syria then, calling on his fellow countrymen to rise up and free themselves from that oppressive yoke. I didn't know that one of the wealthiest men in the world, Carlos Slim, a Mexican of Lebanese heritage, has one of the largest collections of Khalil's art and writings in Mexico City. I didn't know that a crater on the planet Mercury is named after Gibran. I didn't know that one of the U.S. President John F. Kennedy's most famous quotes was taken from an article Khalil wrote in Arabic to his countrymen. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I had no idea that the scope of his influence worldwide, that reached so far geographically, and the diversity and the breadth of the groups that identify with him. I remember being in Timbuktu, Mali, in the Sahara Desert with some friends. We went into the mud brick home of a Tuareg friend, the nomadic blue men of the desert. And there in that little home, there was a French translation of the prophet. And he seems to be claimed by every group and circle imaginable. Khalil the poet, Khalil the novelist, Khalil the essayist, Khalil the activist, Khalil the revolutionary, Khalil the counterculturalist, Khalil the philosopher, Khalil the artist, Khalil the painter, Khalil the modernizer of Arab literature, Khalil the prophet, Khalil the New Age guru, Khalil the visionary, Khalil the humanitarian, Khalil the Sufi, Khalil the Christian, Khalil the universalist, Khalil the interfaith mentor. The list goes on. He's an enigma, begging the question, will the real Khalil Gibran please stand up? The renowned contemporary Syrian poet Adonis summed it up perfectly when speaking of Khalil. He's a star spinning outside the orbit of that other sun in his universal acceptance. Khalil's older friend and fellow writer Amin Rouhani said of him, through Arabic he conquered our minds, and through English he conquered our hearts. Khalil Gibran was born in 1883 into a Maronite Christian family high up in the mountains of Lebanon, a region known as the Kadisha Valley, which literally means the sacred valley. It's a place that has sheltered its people during various invasions and resounds with majestic natural beauty, which had an important and a lasting influence on Gibran. In contrast, though, to those gorgeous, peaceful surroundings, Khalil was born into a time where there was political and interreligious strife, as well as one full of corruption by religious authorities, during the latter part of a 400-year-long Ottoman occupation, all circumstances that would influence his life and work for years to come. He was a quiet, creative child, and his mother stood out as a caring and empowering presence in his life. And sensing his unique creative talents and spiritual sensitivity, she sought to encourage him, and she was able to acquire a book of Leonardo da Vinci's art to give him as a gift. When he was very young, Gibran remembers it actually as a pivotal moment, formative moment in his life. He wrote of the experience, I will never forget that moment as long as I live. It was as if a ship lost in the fog had suddenly found a compass. His grandfather had been a Maronite Catholic priest, and thanks to his mother, he was taught all those great biblical stories, which captured his imagination at a young age and show up again as imagery that echoed throughout his future writing. Khalil's father, though, was not very reliable. He was prone to drink with gambling debts. He was accused of embezzlement while working for the local Ottoman administrator and was sent to prison, and his family's property was lost. And so his mother eventually decided to follow her relatives to America and emigrated here with Khalil's older half-brother, his two younger sisters, during the year before he entered his, what you would say, his teenage years, when he was 12. Although Khalil spent only 12 short years in that magical mountainous setting, It was to serve as the foundation for his spirituality for the rest of his life. And again, it reminds me of Tagore. Tagore's reflections on the role of nature early in his life. He wrote, "I was blessed with a sense of wonder which gives a child his right of entry into the treasure house of mystery in the depths of existence. My communion with the universe has always been through India." Once in America, Gibran's family settled into Boston's South End, and Khalil began to learn English. And a whole new world of artistic influences began to inspire him. And he was introduced to this whole vast new world of literature and art, and he was encouraged in his artistic ability. But concerned that Khalil was losing his Arab culture and its values, his mother decided to send him back to Lebanon to complete his high school education under the watchful care of a Maronite Catholic school in Beirut, no less. And then his story unfolds from there. Upon his return to Boston, within an 18-month period, he lost one of his sisters and his half-brother to tuberculosis, and then his mother to cancer. After a devastating fire that destroyed pretty much all of his artwork to date, he began to write more intensely and became very involved with the world of Arab immigrant writers in Boston. Somewhat parallels again with Tagore, who lost his wife at the age of 30, then soon the death of his father, one of his daughters, and then his youngest son. Before that, his beloved sister-in-law at 25 took her own life. They both knew suffering early on. He began to express his feelings, Gibran did, through outspoken, some might even say scorching, articles in Arabic newspapers in the U.S., books and magazines. And as an immigrant, he discovered that he had the ability, though, to write in a way that he would not have been able to do in the Arab world at that time had he been living there. And he began to call on his Lebanese people to question ideologies as he himself began to grapple with religion and spirituality. He spoke out in his articles against the oppression by the Ottomans and was concerned by sectarian strife that was more often than not fueled by religious leaders and their hypocrisy, as well as women's rights. And for the next 10 years, 1903 to 1913, from the age of 20 to 30, Khalil would seek to balance the push and pull of these two linguistic and artistic worlds as he found himself poised at a confluence of cross-currents between the East and West. And determined to tear down walls of injustice, he eventually found himself threatened with excommunication from authorities in the Maronite Catholic Church of his upbringing. He had just completed a brilliant work titled Spirits Rebellious, in which one of his short stories, titled Khalil the Heretic, blasts the hypocrisy of religious corruption and oppression of the weak and vulnerable. Not surprisingly, not too long after this, while in Paris, representatives from the Patriarch in Lebanon who were visiting France asked to see him and try to put him back in line. He relates the encounter quite lightheartedly. One bishop had a sense of humor, the other none. Not much has changed in that regard. Non-humorists took him aside. You've made a grave mistake and are making a grave mistake. Your gifts you are using against your people, against your country, against your church. The Holy Patriarch realizes this. And now seek out every copy of the book, destroy them all, and let me take word back to Syria and the church and to the Holy Patriarch. Well, as you can imagine, this exchange only spurred Khalil on further. He actually early on saw himself somewhat as a revolutionary and a rebel, saying life without rebellion is like the seasons without spring. He was an advocate for freedom within and without. He wrote to his cousin in Brazil, "The people in Lebanon are calling me a heretic, and the intelligentsia in Egypt vilify me, saying, he's the enemy of just laws and of family ties and of old traditions." Those writers are actually telling the truth, because I do not love man-made laws, and I abhor the traditions that our ancestors left us. Because this hatred is the fruit of my love for the sacred and spiritual kindness, which should be the source of every law on earth. For kindness is the shadow of God in humanity. Through his Arabic novella titled Broken Wings, he became an advocate for women well ahead of his time. He held this incredibly high view of women, whether friend or stranger or lover or sister or mother, and he consistently fused his admiration for them into the essence of his painting and writing. And this is especially noteworthy considering the patriarchal society, of course, of his childhood, and also the time period here in America in which he was immersed as women were in the thick of the fight for the right to vote. Even his view of God echoed these convictions of gender equality and pushed the boundaries of the accepted norm. He wrote, "Most religions speak of God in the masculine gender, but to me God is as much mother as God is father. God is both father and mother in one." However, albeit an activist early on, he wrote often about growing into our greater selves. He matures into someone with a graciousness towards all and an all-embracing spirituality that reaches across the divides of humanity, building bridges of peace. And just like Tagore, who longed for the spiritual unity of humanity, he also became an artistic contemplative and using his many creative gifts to communicate his insights. And like Tagore, writing and art supported one another. When asked which he preferred, he refused to separate them, responding with the impossibility of choosing a favorite child. At a very crucial time in his life, his lifelong friend and patron, Mary Haskell, appeared in a very supportive role to help him set him on a course that would allow him to pursue and cultivate his many gifts. And she eventually funded 2 years of art education in Paris to allow him to master the fundamentals. And from that experience, he was able to discover and cultivate his own unique style that the world now knows him for. After his time in Paris, he moved to New York City, and he continued to publish works in Arabic and exhibited his artwork at a few significant galleries there. But then in 1918, his first book, written in English, not translated, was published, titled The Madman. And this is when Gibran began to be seen as the Middle Eastern counterpart to Tagore. It was quickly followed by a second book in English titled The Forerunner. And by 1923, his third book in English, The Prophet, quickly gained worldwide acclaim, as Khalil's message of universality and respect was reaching wider audiences. And he also worked on his longest English book, Jesus, the Son of Man, for much of his adult life, seeking to return the Jesus that he felt had been disfigured by the West back to his Middle Eastern origins, publishing this creative masterwork just 3 years before he died at the age of 48. Tagore was also passionate about this, seeing it as tragic that the Eastern Jesus had been linked to Western empire and privilege, and really in that way not allowing the world to really get the wisdom of Jesus. The more I studied Khalil's fascinating life, I became more and more intrigued with his inner journey. More than anything else, it was evident that his life was lived toward what you might say a deeper dimension. And he wove this passionate intent into his writings and his art. He was a natural mystic who quite simply sought to build bridges and tear down walls. And his voice is timeless, appealing to heart and mind, faith and reason, a guiding spirit at a time when stereotypes and misunderstandings, creating polarization, are certainly increasing ever-widening divides. As he so powerfully wrote, "I believe in the book that makes us all sisters and brothers equal before the sun." Certainly heeding his wisdom would go a long way toward healing our world. And in this regard, there seem to be, to me, 2 overarching themes to Gibran's life and work. And the best analogy I could come up with is that of a river flowing deep and wide. As Khalil plumbed the depths of his inner life, he went to the core of human existence. He was forever exploring the deepest of life's questions, On the purpose of being, he writes, spiritual awakening is the most essential thing in life, and it's the sole purpose of being. He who does not befriend his soul is an enemy to humanity, for life emerges from within. Tagore similarly wrote, union with the divine already exists at the heart of our being. Khalil described himself as going into the silence, intentionally and literally so. And he wrote, only when you drink from the river of silence shall you indeed sing. He even named his New York studio the Hermitage, decorating it sparsely in a manner that created very much a contemplative atmosphere for him. I love Khalil's short story called The Tempest. It's infused with the imagery of the Hermitage in his childhood village in Lebanon of Bishari, now the place where he's actually buried. But this little story tells of a young man who's roaming the cedar forest, the majestic cedar forest in Lebanon, one autumn afternoon, and gets caught in this terrible rainstorm. And he seeks cover in an isolated shelter inhabited by a hermit, Yusuf el-Fakri. He's heard of Yusuf from the local villagers, and he longed to meet him one day, hoping to kind of learn his spiritual secrets. And so this storm provides him the perfect opportunity to go into this hermitage. And when the young man is welcomed into the shelter, he notices that the old hermit is tending to a bird with broken wings. So symbolism abounds here. And the old hermit, Yusuf, engages in conversation and slowly imparts his wisdom through all this beautiful imagery. He shares that he left the world to live in the awakeness of life and to think upon the compelling and beautiful mystery of existence. He said, I came to this far corner of God's domain, for I hungered to learn the secrets of the universe and approach close to the throne of God. And the climax of the story is reached when the hermit leaves the young man, sheltered there in the hermitage, and walks out during the height of the storm. And he said, I am now going to walk through the night with the tempest. It's a practice that I enjoy greatly. I hope you will teach yourself to love the tempest. Khalil consistently succeeded at crafting really poetic invitations to journey toward the depth of oneself, exploring that rich reservoir within. In another reflection, he notes, God has placed in each soul an apostle to lead us on an illumined path. Yet many seek life from without, unaware that it's within them. When someone asked him once, what's a mystic? Khalil is said to have smiled and replied, nothing very secret nor formidable, just someone who has drawn aside one more veil. I'm reminded of Tagore's visionary experiences as a young adult. In reflecting on it, he said, a veil was suddenly withdrawn and all finally became luminous. Khalil was constantly listening, paying attention to life and ever in search of greater interior depth. The soul is mightier than space, he said, stronger than time, deeper than the sea, and higher than the stars. He was preoccupied during his entire life with the depths he knew the spirit of humanity was able to plumb and the heights that he was convinced humanity was destined to scale, always striving towards that deeper dimension. Khalil spoke of his painting process in similar terms to his friend and patron, Mary Haskell. He said, when I paint a picture, I try to give the picture a presence. It's a coming together of certain elements in a certain way as if they made sort of a path along which God can come through to our consciousness. Another time he wrote to her, I've obtained a first-rate telescope, and I spend an hour or two every evening staring up into infinity, close to that which is distant and remote, in awe of the greater whole. Khalil saw depth everywhere. I remember the phrase of Tagore where he said the universe is a living temple of the divine. The collection of imagery and created synonyms Khalil used for God are many: the infinite, the almighty, God creator, nature, love, eternal wisdom, unseen, eternal altar, all-powerful, supreme infinite, Lord of life, of love, and of death, great spirit, great intelligent being, great power, the unknown, the great sea, the absolute, great river. Of Khalil's belief in God, his contemporary Lebanese biographer Alexander Najjar writes this: what kind of God did Gibran believe in? His view of God was not mainstream. Gibran's mysticism is a convergence of several different influences: Christianity, Islam, Sufism, the Baha'i faith, theosophy, and Jungian psychology. It was a message of coexistence. He rejected fanaticism and religious segregation of any kind and called his own convictions from a synthesis of the different religious messages without their dogmatism. And over again, Khalil focused on his love for God rather than religion. When asked, "What is religion?" he responds, "What is it? I know only life. Life to me means the field, the vineyard, and the loom. The church is within you. You yourself are your priest." Tagore termed it the God within us. And during a time of deep despair and questioning, Gibran wrote, "But somehow when I feel like a little helpless fish in a muddy lake, I cannot help but say to myself, the air which is above the water is not muddy. I cannot lose my faith in the God element." And in a time when it becomes harder and harder to listen to our inner selves and our souls, or even what we may need spiritually, Khalil exemplifies someone who journeyed intentionally inward, creating room for silence, to listen to the quiet nudgings of his soul, and intent on allowing both the high and low moments of life to weave together into one voice. And it's that voice within a voice that Khalil wanted his readers to hear when reading his writings. As a good friend, the eminent American architect and writer Claude Bragdon wrote, "Khalil's power came from some great reservoir of spiritual life, else it could not have been so universal or so potent. But the majesty and beauty of his language with which he clothed it were certainly all his own." This depth is what led the actor Salma Hayek to produce an animated film on Khalil's book, The Prophet. One of the most enjoyable parts of working on this book was to go to the premiere of this film at the Toronto Film Festival. And it was produced by Salma Hayek, but it was directed by Roger Ayers, who was known for The Lion King. And the film really was a visual extravaganza. At the after party, I had the opportunity of speaking with Salma a little bit about her inspiration in producing the film. And with her contagious exuberance, she shared her own connection to the Prophet through her Lebanese grandfather in Mexico, whom she adored. And as a child, she remembered he always kept a copy of the Prophet on his bedside table. As a young adult, she read the Prophet herself and was profoundly moved. She told me, "I found out that there are millions of people around the world who have shared the same kind of connection with this book, in which the words of Khalil have so strongly impacted them positively and spiritually. And when you read this book, something really strange happens. Inside of you, your soul recognizes it as truth." And she went on to tell us that's why she made the film. She said, "I thought it was crucial that we pay further tribute to this man who was an Arab, who wrote a book of spiritual philosophy that unites all religions and all countries and all creeds from many different generations." And in those comments, I believe Salma really captured the essence of Khalil's spiritual journey. For the deeper he went, the wider his embrace became. The depth of Khalil's spiritual journey led to an extraordinary breadth of spirit in which he experienced the oneness of humanity. The reservoirs that he cultivated in the deep gave him the capacity to go wide. And arising from this internalized bridging of the Eastern and Western influences of his life, a faith emerged over time that transcended all cultures and traditions and religions. Addressing his fellow Arabs in the Middle East, Khalil wrote, "Humans are divided into different clans and tribes and belong to countries and towns. But I find myself a stranger to all communities and belong to no settlement. The universe is my country, and the human family is my tribe. Thou art my brother and sister because you are human, and we are both children of one Holy Spirit. We are equal and made of the same earth." Tagore put it this way: "The God of humanity has arrived at the gates of the ruined temple of the tribe." Khalil went beyond religion, really to a core of universal spirituality. Tagore similarly says this: "The true purpose of religion is to touch the divine in our depths, awakening us to our spiritual nature." Khalil's beliefs cut across all those divides, reaching across to the other. As he so powerfully said, "Your neighbor is your other self, dwelling behind a wall. In understanding all walls shall fall down." Khalil recognized the necessity of boundaries, nations, and yet he strove toward really what you might call a borderless citizenship that transcends geography. And I love the way he expressed his collective embrace of humanity with his poetic imagery, visual imagery of a cloud. He wrote, "Should you sit upon a cloud, you would not see the boundary line between one country and another, nor the boundary stone between a farm and a farm. It's a pity you cannot sit upon a cloud." Khalil's ever-embracing spirituality was expressed thoughtfully in his collection of aphorisms in English titled Sand and Foam. This is what he wrote: "Should you really open your eyes and see, you would behold your image in all images. And should you open your ears and listen, you would hear your own voice in all voices." And touching on the most sensitive topic of all, certainly in the Middle East, religion, this is what he does. He looks to the nature of God. "You are my brother and sister, and I love you. I love you worshiping in your church, or kneeling in your temple, or praying in your mosque. You and I are children of one religion, for the varied paths of religion are but the fingers of the loving hand of the Supreme Being extended to all, offering completeness of spirit to all, and anxious to receive all." And finding a way to powerfully communicate a non-sectarian version of spirituality was something that weighed very heavily on Gibran. And consequently, he felt that all the events of his life led him toward the creation of his most well-known book, The Prophet. This is what it looked like when it first came out. It was called The Little Black Book. "It's the biggest challenge of my life. My entire being is in the Prophet. Everything I've ever done before was only a prelude to this." And he felt a sense of sacred responsibility in writing it. It's almost as if he saw it as a holy book. Even the process of writing it was a type of spiritual rebirth for him. And embodying East and West, it speaks to people from all religions, and it prompted his friend and patron and sometimes editor, Mary Haskell, to remark upon first receiving a copy of The Prophet, "Oh, Khalil, it's the most loving book ever written." It made its literary debut at a church in Manhattan, where it was read through. Khalil was in attendance, and he commented afterward, "I had wanted it first read in a church." Interestingly, as Khalil continued to journey spiritually, he sought to sift through all of his own religious background and all the baggage, trappings, and traditions that accumulated around it over the millennia. And just as the Dalai Lama is said to have encouraged the Trappist monk and writer Thomas Merton to not convert to Buddhism, but to rather go deep in his own tradition, and Khalil decided to do the same thing. And in so doing, he ends up discovering the figure of Jesus in a new way. And he came to see the person of Jesus as far beyond Christianity, but instead as a universal sage for all humanity. And in Jesus, he saw this all-embracing figure, and he was enraptured by his character. His life is the symbol of humanity, he wrote. He shall always be the supreme figure of all ages. Mirrors Tagore in some ways. Tagore wrote, "Great-souled Christ, we who are not Christians bow before you. We love you and worship you." One of my favorite little vignettes of Khalil's is about separating the Jesus of history from the Jesus of a religion, Christianity, that grew up around him after his life. Khalil writes this, "Once every 100 years, Jesus of Nazareth meets Jesus of the Christian in a garden among the hills of Lebanon, and they talk long. And each time Jesus of Nazareth goes away saying to Jesus of the Christian, 'My friend, I fear we shall never, never agree.'" Observing the corruption and inequalities and sectarian power plays of the church in Lebanon at that time, he was naturally drawn to the radical aspect of Jesus' all-embracing, inclusive love and the strength of his humility. It was the antithesis of everything he saw in the church at that time. Khalil considered Jesus to be the greatest of all artists and poets, the master poet who makes poets of us all. Reflects Tagore when he describes his religion as a poet's religion. Khalil also pictured Jesus as a fellow Middle Easterner and felt this deep personal cultural connection to him, and hence the opportunity to write about Jesus became this ever-increasing aspiration. And his book, Jesus the Son of Man, was the longest and the last book Khalil wrote before his death. Some see it as kind of a fifth gospel, and in it he delivers this mesmerizing picture of Jesus. In the book, he portrays the life of Jesus through the eyes and voices of 77 different individuals, some historic, some fictional. And many are women who he speaks about with great admiration and depth of spirit. But his portrayal of Jesus through the eyes of Mary Magdalene profoundly illustrates how he'd come to see Jesus. This is what he writes. He gives voice to Mary Magdalene. "It was during the month of June when I heard him for the first time, and he was walking in the wheat field. The rhythm of his step was different from other men's steps, and the movement of his body was like naught I had ever seen before. Men do not pace the earth in that manner, and even now I do not know whether he walked fast or slow, and I gazed at him, and as I did, my soul quivered within me, for he was beautiful. I left my house and I walked towards him. Even now I do not know, but when his dawn eyes looked into my eyes, all the stars of my night faded away." Jesus then speaks to Mary Magdalene. "Other men see a beauty in you that shall fade sooner than your own years, but I see in you a beauty that shall not fade away. And in the autumn of your days, that beauty shall not be afraid to gaze at itself in the mirror, and it shall not be offended, for I alone love the unseen in you." And then Mary reflects. "Then he stood up, and he looked at me as the seasons might look down upon the field, and he smiled. And he said again, 'All men love you for themselves, but I love you for yourself.' And then he walked away. But no other man ever walked the way he walked. Was it a breath born in my garden that moved to the east? Or was it a storm that would shake all things to their foundations? I knew not, but on that day the sunset of his eyes slew the dragon in me." Although Khalil often spoke directly of God, his writings and art were infused with a far deeper concern, which was quite simply living in harmony with one another and with creation. He wrote, "I bid you to speak not so freely of God, who may be your all, but speak rather to and understand one another, neighbor unto neighbor." And so Khalil, while spirituality served as an attempt to connect with the transcendent, with the divine, he realized that it could not be found in creeds or dogma. and that to search for God solely in a mosque or a temple or a synagogue or a church was to limit one's search for wholeness. And so his quest actually becomes an opportunity very similar to Tagore's, to unearth that which is woven into the very fabric of the earth, of creation. In other words, the environment. Powerful for us today, in an age when our environment is at the forefront, with deep respect needed for the earth. His holistic worldview rings forth. And he did not separate the spiritual dimension from the natural world, but he saw them completely in harmony. Just after Easter, 1931, after a battle with ill health, Khalil lay dying. He was taken to St. Vincent's Hospital in New York City, the same hospital that had received survivors of the Titanic disaster for treatment, and then again was used to treat victims from the September 11 tragedy. At age 48, with cirrhosis of the liver and tuberculosis in one lung, Khalil slipped from this world into a realm he believed would be an endless dawn, forever the first day. The breadth of diversity in the outpouring of appreciation of his life says it all, across all religious and cultural divides. In New York City, a rabbi who had known Khalil early on undertook the task of arranging the tribute. It was titled A Tribute to the Spirit of Khalil Gibran, and it was a mosaic of diversity, with leaders of numerous faith traditions praising his life: Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Baha'i, Theosophist. As requested in his will, Khalil's body made the pilgrimage all the way back to Lebanon. And upon arriving by ship in Beirut, the coffin was opened and he was posthumously awarded the Decoration of Fine Arts from the Ministry of Education. And then, led by governmental dignitaries, French military officers, diplomats from all over the world, and leaders from the Christian, Muslim, Druze, Baha'i, and Jewish communities, along with crowds of schoolchildren, the entourage processed past thousands of admirers who lined the streets until they reached the Maronite Catholic Cathedral, where his body was blessed by the Archbishop. Once thought of as a rebel by the church, in the end he was welcomed home as a native son. And in the tribute to Khalil that was held that next day at Beirut's Grand Theater, the president of Lebanon, renowned writers and poets, representatives from the various faith traditions of Lebanon, all reflected on Khalil's spirituality and universal appeal. He was a Sufi sage for all humanity, said one of the Christian speakers in his tribute to Khalil. Then the procession on foot made the 50-mile journey from Beirut up to his home village of Bishari, and all the way was lined with townspeople. They stopped 20 times for local ceremonies. And then he was eventually laid to rest, as he requested, in the hermitage grotto of his childhood, high in the mountains near his beloved cedar trees, which is now actually the Gibran Museum. More than ever, Khalil's own words rang true. For in one soul are contained the hopes and feelings of all mankind. Reminds me of Albert Schweitzer's comment upon Tagore's death. This completely noble and harmonious thinker belongs not only to his own people, but to humanity. One of my favorite allegories by Khalil is titled The River. It's often read at funerals and memorial services, but it highlights visually Khalil's own life journey, one mixed with both joy and suffering, but always leading to that deeper realm. The river. In the river where the mighty river flows, in the valley where the mighty river flows, two little streams met and spoke to one another. One stream said, "How came you, my friend, and how was your path?" And the other answered, "My path was most encumbered. The wheel of the mill was broken, and the master farmer who used to conduct me from my channel to his plants is dead. I struggled down, oozing with the waste of those who do not but sit and bake their laziness in the sun. But how is your path, my brother?" And the other stream answered and said, "Mine was a different path. I came down the hills among fragrant flowers and shy willows, and men and women drank of me with their silvery cups, and little children paddled their rosy feet at my edges. And there was laughter all about me, and there were sweet songs. What a pity that your path was not so happy. And at that moment, the great river spoke with a loud voice and said, come in, we are going to the sea. Come in, speak no more. Be with me now, we are going to the sea. Come in, for in me you shall forget your wanderings, sad or joyful. Come in, and you and I will forget all our ways when we reach the heart of our mother, the sea. Khalil's life journey of depth and breadth can't help but challenge all of us. His words continue to reverberate in hearts and minds, stirring the reader, the hearer, whoever he or she may be, to journey toward a deeper dimension. And he reminds us that it's time to reach across the divides that surround us and break down walls of inequality and injustice. It's time to build bridges in whatever ways we can conceive and to seek peaceful resolutions. It's time to defend the vulnerable and the oppressed. It's time to unite and see our own reflections in the faces of all others. It's time to find a way to carve out room for quiet and respect for creation, the environment. It's time to delve deeper into our own faith traditions, whatever they are, past all the outward imperfections and trappings to the core of life. In one final vignette from Khalil, his words inspire and challenge us toward that phrase he used all the time, toward our greater selves. It's titled, Set a Sheet of Snow White Paper. Set a sheet of snow white paper. Pure was I created, and pure will I remain forever. I would rather be burnt and turned to white ashes than suffer darkness to touch me or the unclean to come near me. And the ink bottle heard what the paper was saying, and it laughed in its dark heart, but it never dared to approach her. And the multicolored pencils heard her also, and they too, though, never came near her. And the snow-white piece of paper did remain pure and chaste forever. Pure and chaste and empty. I close with the moving words of Khalil's good friend, Mikhail Naimi, who wrote the first biography of him just 3 years after his death. For some purpose unknown to you and to me, Gibran was born in Lebanon at the time he was born. And for a reason hidden from me, Arabic, from you and me, Arabic was his mother tongue. It would seem that the all-seeing eye perceived our spiritual drought and sent us this rain-bearing cloud to drizzle some relief to our parching souls. Thank you. As an atheist, it's hard for me to understand the idea of a soul. Would Gibran equate belief in God with the existence of soul and spirituality? Is the soul the self? Thank you. Wow. I would say that Gibran, and one could say probably this of Tagore as well, had this inherent sense of something other than just this. And in that regard, I think you could say within his culture and tradition and background and upbringing, he did his best in his way to connect with, is this still on? Yeah, yes, okay. Yes. To connect with that dimension, if you will. And, but interestingly, he was in the writer-artist circuit world, and many were what you might call atheist or agnostics in that regard. And so he got along very well with them. So it wasn't a necessity in that way. But he was definitely oriented on another plane. And however one wants to term that plane, even if it's the core of the best of humanity, that's where he was. So for a simple answer, that's a simple answer at that time. In an increasingly intolerant world where technology is helping spread hatred like wildfire, please elaborate on Gibran's view on tolerance and how to balance between good and evil with wisdom. I thought it was going to say, please elaborate on his view of cell phones or, basically, I would say, the way he, threefold in some ways, I would say he approached it. One was that his whole passion was to build on the common, what they have in common with the other, wherever your starting point is. And when I read Gibran, I like to think of it this way. The Islamic symbol of faith is a crescent, right? And when you see a crescent, it's only that part of the moon that you can see because of the reflection. But the majority of the moon, whenever you see a crescent, is dark. And Gibran's writing would pretty much echo that our challenge before us is, if you say that dark side of the moon is what we have in common with everyone, and little crescent is what we have different. And the challenge for us, like never before, is to build our relationships with the other on the dark side of the moon. And in doing that, it provides this wonderful, solid foundation to eventually explore the crescent together, but from a different starting point. So building on the commonalities is one thing, I would say. The other thing I would say is he saw himself as a pilgrim or as a journeyer, never having arrived. In other words, in a lot of religion, of course, a lot of politics, kind of puts frameworks around things, right? And there are boundaries. And he was boundaryless in that way and was willing to actually move. And so that mindset of being a journeyer or a pilgrim allows one to ask for help and guidance and insight from wherever it is. I like to think of it, I grew up in the desert, the Sahara Desert area, and you never could make that trip alone through the desert. You are reliant on everyone you come across. And I think that's an interesting metaphor for life in general. And Tagore and Gibran would very much embody that. Any other questions? Raja.
Did Khalil ever travel to India? And was he influenced by the Indian philosophy? Did he ever read the Bhagavad Gita and things like that?
Yeah. Well, he was, first of all, did he ever travel to India? Gibran ended up, in many ways, believing in a form of reincarnation. Or he had a sense that, and so he often would describe what he thinks was a former life, where he was born in India, and I think he even said from some princely family at that time. But in that sense, he was reflecting upon a former life that he would surmise he might have had. He was influenced by a lot of Indian philosophy, and some of the contemporary figures like Krishnamurti were individuals that greatly influenced him. One thing that's interesting is you learn a lot about people when you see their library, right? And so in the Gibran Museum in Lebanon, in Bashari, the little village up in the mountains, they have his library. And it's fascinating to look at who he read. And so there was a good bit on Krishnamurti at that time that I saw there. Any other questions? Yes.
Do you think we can create more of the prophets in such kind of a days right now? Is it a movement that is getting really bigger, or is it just still small in your perspective?
I have to say, I thought for a period of time, if I'm being honest, that we were moving very much in that direction. I think there's an element of kind of going backwards in some ways, more recently. But I think at the same time, you increasingly have a younger generation that is much more oriented and more tolerant, more all-embracing, more inclusive in the way they see the world. And so I have great hope. At the end of the day, I'm an optimist when I look at, for example, my kids and where they're at. So yeah, I think there's some possibility in the future.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your talk. I was wondering, when you told us how you retraced this path, how you visited all these different places and islands, I imagine that while you were doing that, you experienced several moments. What was the biggest, or what caused that? Where did you experience that the most?
It's a good question. She said, as I journeyed for this book to all the places where he lived and worked and wrote, what was one of the more aha moments for me? I had many, actually, as you can imagine, not just because of the place, but because of what I was reading from his work at that time. But without a doubt, the highlight is where he was born and where he lives now. In Bishari, it's a sacred place. It's hard to describe. And there's a sense of harmony there. And you begin to become part of it just by your presence. And I remember the first time I went up there was during a snowstorm. And you're going up through the mountains, and unlike here, where they may have barriers on the side where you can't go over, it's pretty tense. And I think it only took normally an hour and a half to get up there, but for us it took about 4 hours because of the weather. And but as I toured the Gibran Museum and then came out on this large kind of patio porch, looking out, I felt there's a sense that I didn't need to do anything more myself. That I actually had already been profoundly blessed, by the spirit of that place. So I would encourage everyone, maybe not this week because Lebanon's a little bit hot, but to eventually take a trip there and experience that,
When you say in harmony, is Bishari well protected from the Israeli missiles?
From the what? Israeli Mossad. Yeah, no, yeah, I'm not really familiar with all the Mossad's activities and actions, but yes, they don't seem to bother in the mountains there, in that Maronite area. And they tend to focus more in South Beirut, and south. And so this is up more in the north, and or toward the north, northeast. So yeah. And it's you would never know there's any tension in the world when you visit Bishari. It's so removed. It's like when we lived in Cairo. Whenever there was something quite dramatic, like a terrorist activity or something like that, we had no idea it was happening. People from the U.S. would call, "Are you all right?" And we're like, "What happened?" So there's a sense in which life continues. But Bishari itself and up in the Maronite mountainous area is peaceful. Yes.
I'm kind of curious about his, formative years growing up in Lebanon. I guess he went back when he was 15 years old. If you could tell us a little bit about the Mennonite Catholic Church, the history of that church, and how that church was formed, and what is it in the present day?
Yeah. The majority of Christians in Lebanon, which are about probably 49% of the country now, are Christian. The rest Muslim, Sunni and Shia. But the majority of the Christian populace would be Maronite, and it originates from quite a well-known figure, who they would call now Saint Maroon, and it's an Eastern church in the sense of their liturgy, but they're in communion with Rome. Okay, but the service would kind of look Eastern in that way if you went to one of their church services. They are known to be, from a Civil War standpoint, they are known to be great fighters, largely because they've had to protect themselves over the years, the centuries, and the president of Lebanon is always Christian, prime minister is Sunni Muslim, and then the Druze have a particular, slot as well in the government. So it's kind of an interesting way they've gone about it. Makes it difficult today with an increased polarized world. But the Christians would tend to live more in the north of Beirut, and then North Beirut and north, and then into the mountainous area as well in the northeast.
So do they predate the Jesuits or are they after the Jesuits?
They would, when would the Jesuits be? What century is that? I think they would predate the Jesuits, I would think, but
So would it be
it's
more
an
like
ancient church.
More like an Orthodox church or?
Very similar to the Orthodox Church. You would hardly know the difference when you actually go into the service.
So does that mean they have a different Christmas?
I don't know I think they do have the Eastern Christmas. I'm not sure, but being there in communion with Rome, they may actually stay with the Western Christmas. But the other Christians there are the Greek Orthodox and the Armenian Orthodox as well. And then you have some Protestants, but smaller groupings.
So was there any influence of that, the church teachings?
On him? Yeah, he was very influenced by the stories, the biblical stories. But he was also very influenced by the negative that he saw, the kind of power, mongering of the clergy, and then the way they treated women, for example, and the corruption was tremendous at that time. As I mentioned in the talk, is that he saw it as he got to study the figure of Jesus himself. All that he had observed was the antithesis of everything that claimed Jesus' name, so.
And if I can ask one more
Sure.
question. So I'm kind of curious, when he moved to Paris, did it change his worldviews and his views of religion? Because I understand that he probably was expecting a baby at that time.
Yeah, no, that's actually, there's a rumor of that, if you will, at that time. Historically, it doesn't look like that was accurate, that he wasn't, and that this other woman was pregnant. So I would say he wasn't.
I read the poem, I read commentaries on the poem. It's a little bit of a different philosophy in my opinion,
Paris changed
but there
him
are,
is
I
that
think,
he
some
went to
parallels.
traditional art school and found constraints in it. And so he ended up leaving the art school and actually kind of identifying with the symbolist, well-known symbolist painter, which is a genre of art, at that time, and kind of became self kind of taught, if you will, in that way, mentored by that individual, Yep.
I have one last question.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Can you tell us something about your latest enterprise on Caravan, like how you're bridging all the Abrahamic religions together and bringing the interfaith and creating harmony, peace, and love?
Sure.
And through art. So how are you doing that?
Yeah. So I lead an organization called Caravan that uses the arts to build bridges between those of diverse backgrounds, whether it be ethnicities or cultures or religious traditions, etc., to help reframe and change stereotypes of the other. And really, in one sense, it's not so much about interfaith dialogue, but it's about the art being a catalyst to facilitate interfaith friendship or intercultural friendships, not just religious. And it started when we were living in Cairo, when the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, the intellectual and the spiritual heart of Sunni Islam, they had all these interfaith meetings, and most were incredibly boring. And the same old people came all the time. And I had a background in the arts, and my father was an artist, and so I suggested that we take this old historic church in Cairo and turn it into an art gallery, and have premier Western artists and premier Middle Eastern artists, both Christian and Muslim Middle Eastern artists, and titled the exhibition On a Caravan. We're journeying together through the arts. And we had 10,000 people come over the course of 2 weeks, instead of 100 maybe for those typical interfaith gatherings. So it got us thinking differently, and eventually it evolved into an NGO or a 501c3, a nonprofit, that strategically uses the arts for that purpose, for transformational purposes in that regard. And our focus is on Middle East, so that could be, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, it could be Arab, Jewish, Persian, or Iranian.
You can see anything that written from him about these times,
Middle Eastern contemporary
like any
artists,
predictions,
and
any
Native
writings
American
that
contemporary
besides
artists,
the prophet
and
that
black
talks about
artists,
what we
whether
are
they're
going
from
through as a
Africa or
collective
the
consciousness
African
right
diaspora.
now.
So
Would you
African Americans,
prefer
etc.
something?
I think it's all about changing people's perceptions of the other, but through art.
Did
Sure.
Iran have any influence in India and China?
Ironically, the Prophet is most sold in China, in Chinese, And so, just the book, The Prophet, and it's become very popular there. India, my experience is that a number of people have read The Prophet in India, but it wasn't his own direct involvement. It's after, after his life, really, in that regard. What questions do you have unanswered still about the author of The Prophet, and what do you think the answers are? Wow, that's quite a question. Well, I mean, I think the questions are, one could stay here all day, because he was definitely a man of mystery. But I think what interested me in him is he wasn't a saint. He died of cirrhosis of the liver and tuberculosis in one lung. And yet, not being, who knows what a saint really is, right? But not being what we qualify as a saint, was able to live at that deeper level, spiritual level, and provide a resource for us, a well, a deep, deep well from which we still continue to water ourselves. And so that to me is intriguing, the paradox or the dichotomy of that, if you will. It also, to me, makes him more attractive and relatable as well, because he was human, just like all of us in that way. Regarding the empowerment of women, did he do anything specific? Yeah, well, he wrote a lot about it, and both in stories and in essays about that. And he didn't just mean here, he also meant, of course, in his own country as well, which was at that time under the Ottoman occupation. So he was very proactive in that regard. And if you look at the women that associated with him, they were very free-thinking and kind of liberated women during his time. So he experienced the gift of really remarkable women around him. And one thing I would say is, Gibran, we would know nothing about Gibran if it were not for one particular woman named Mary Haskell, who was his friend and patron and sponsor and sometimes editor, because you remember he wrote in English, which was his second language in that regard. So women had a profound role in shaping his own existence in life. What was his way of dealing with all the tragedies in his life? That's a really great question. I think twofold. One is he expressed it from a literary standpoint, in print, in words, and at the same time found that someone asked me, the last time I gave a talk on Gibran, how would he have handled World War II? Because he passed away before that, And there is an interesting letter from someone saying, thank God he passed away before World War II, because he was such a sensitive soul, he couldn't have handled it, in that regard. And so, but you could say he was an alcoholic, especially during the latter part of his life, and hence the cirrhosis of the liver. That's one way he handled it. And he smoked quite significantly, hence the lung, tuberculosis in his lung. And so it's not like he found all the solutions himself to the answers. And so he was on a journey, doing what he knew how to do to the best of his ability, but very human in that regard.
From the picture you painted, where he lived, sound very serene, harmony, versus the world we live today has been very fast. What's your challenge to us in the search of our spirituality?
What's the challenge?
What's your in today's world being very fast, what's your idea of how we see?
I'm hearing and I am listening to everyone.
I think it's
hear
impossible.
My mom and dad, and
without
I come
pulling
from the Middle
aside
East, and yes, we are
life.
not as
And,
much as I
so
want us
however
to be,
that is, whether you have
but
your
we are
own
powerful.
kind of
We are strong,
practices
and I think our
to do
message
that,
and our
it means
pain
time for quiet.
is going to speak
I
louder
went
than
through a very
anything
difficult
else.
period last year myself, and I would say, my wife and I started attending a Quaker meeting, which of course nothing happens in the Quaker meeting for an hour of just silence, in communal silence. But something magical also happens. And I'd never done that before. I've been in silence in a group gathering of 10 minutes or whatever. But an hour of sitting there in silence. And eventually what happens is you kind of come into a different dimension eventually. Yeah, your mind wanders for a while, but then it settles. And when that settling happens, it's amazing how the centering that it can provide in one's life. And so everybody's made differently. And so I would just say my encouragement and challenge in that regard would be to find what works for you, to gather, to allow you time to explore the inner core of your own, humanity and existence. And if you believe in the other, however you want to term the other, how to connect with that, in that regard, depending on your tradition. But it has to be intentional, and all the more so now in contrast with our world and the speed that it's in, I mean, I just the other day was realizing, oh, my neck is hurting me terribly. And I realized it's too much time on the phone, right? It's this life, so it's all right, that's a check, a sign, change something, so. Actually, who was Mary Haskell? Mary Haskell he met in Boston. She was a teacher, and then and was in kind of the literary artistic circle of Boston, which in many ways, because of Mary, he was introduced into that circle. They had a romantic relationship. She was significantly older than he was, but they did not marry. And then it kind of evolved into kind of an intimate, non-physical relationship of support and encouragement. She was taken with his kind of depth of spirituality, and so they were soulmates, if you will. She eventually married someone named Minnis down in Savannah, Georgia, and moved down there. And so when the prophet came out, she was already living in Savannah, Georgia. And but a remarkable woman, and someone who's a scholar of Gibran as well, has written an outstanding book on Mary, and I know she's looking towards seeing it published. But it's the other side of the story, if you will, and she didn't need the attention. She was kind of behind the scenes, and there was a sense, I think she identified Gibran as he was a teenager when they first met, that is a spiritual prodigy. And she kind of felt part of her life calling was to come alongside and help him. And the intensity of that depth of connection led to a short romantic experience, but it was far, far more than that. And it lasted to the very end. So it was a true love story, albeit not a physical romantic love story in that regard.
And she's still alive?
No, she passed away. Yeah, she passed away. Yeah.
So Gibran never married?
Gibran never married. No, never married. And I think when that's one thing you would read, as he had some lovers, but he never married because I think he might have been difficult to be married to. He was very taken with this other world, And was the prophet originally written in English? Yes, it was. And that's what makes it so remarkable, because it was his second language. Any other questions?
I actually have a follow-up question.
Okay.
What Ashok asked.
Okay.
In terms of his influence on India.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about any sort of influence of Gandhi on him, or of him on Gandhi?
Mm-hmm. The only thing he never mentions Gandhi, but in the library there were a few books about Gandhi. Okay, and of course they're contemporaries, right? So even all that was written and has been written on Gandhi wasn't yet available. But he does seem taken by, and actually if you look at a lot of his art, not this of course, but there's a sense in which one thinks he probably read the Upanishads and the various Vedas and that kind of thing. And so he's, in some ways the art matches that in a sense, but not much verbally communicated about it.
And one more follow-up.
Please.
So the poem you read in the end, on the two rivers, do you see any parallel with this poem by Tagore on the two birds?
On the two birds, yeah, and I have read that one, but I'm not familiar enough with it right now. So, did you? Do you?
I read the poem, I read commentaries on the poem. It's a little bit of a different philosophy in my opinion, but there are, I think,
Some similarities, maybe.
Some similarities there. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I'm going to go read it this evening. Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering, is there anything in New York still, the Hermitage or any other places that he
Yeah.
their collections?
That building that he was in has been knocked down, and there's a modern building on it. The hospital where he died has, I think, also been, since 9/11, has been knocked down. St. Vincent's Hospital. What is left there? There are some parks and areas that have memorials to him, but not a lot visible in that way. So. In France, there's a plaque up in the apartment, outside the apartment building where he lived.
Hi, Yvette here. You mentioned that he had met Abdu'l-Baha and who had a profound impact on him. Can you share with us a little bit about what that impact was?
Yeah, he writes a good bit about that. And I would say it's very possible that of all the faith traditions, other than Christianity, because he came out of Christianity, about other faith traditions other than his own that he was most influenced by, it was the Baha'i. And already, of course, the Baha'i have this kind of broad, universal way of looking at the faith traditions, right? And looking at and building on the commonalities that exist between all of them. He has said various things about Gibran, about when he wrote the book, Jesus, the Son of Man, the person he had in mind was Abdu'l-Baha. So it was kind of this figure that was always there, a guiding kind of image, if you will, for that. So, and he attributes, and he views that Jesus, the Son of Man, and I would say the same thing, as his greatest work, not the prophet, and worked on it far longer, and so it was this always there in the back of his mind. How do I represent this Jesus figure in a way that I see him as having been, not distorted by the West and not distorted by the religion that claims his name, Yeah.
Can I speak, if we can see anything that written from him about these times, like any predictions, any writings that beside the prophet that talks about what we are going through as a collective consciousness right now, would you prefer something?
I mean, I think reading his book of aphorisms, Sand and Foam, is very interesting and insightful for us at this time. Of course, he's not writing it for this time, but it's very relevant, and that came after the prophet. Yeah. And it's just short little statements, but profound, and great relevance to us today. Sand and Foam.
Any final thoughts in terms of, with your knowledge and experience, in terms of the peace process, elements of peace? How do you see maybe additional thoughts as how you maybe seeing things unfolding with what's going on in the Middle East? Any additional thoughts that you think you'd like us to be aware of?
Any additional thoughts related to the unfolding crisis in the Middle East? Wow. Yeah.
Elements of peace that you think that they might, some parties might be receptive to, as you mentioned, in terms of the fundamentalism and the dogmas. How do you get through those veils?
I think it's always interesting, and we were commenting last night about, if you go to Iran today and the younger generation, you'll find great receptivity to Americans in the West, interestingly. The impression often that the West has, right, is, that they all look a certain way and think the same thing and da-da-da-da. I would say the same is true very much about our Israeli sisters and brothers. If you go there, there's a whole faction that wants peace and that wants a two-state solution. And if it wasn't for our country kind of unilaterally almost propping up a certain aspect of Israel that's there, I think there would be a lot more chance, to honestly hear and listen and naturally respect the other. I'm a proponent, though now I'm actually a proponent for more than the two-state solution. And but do I see it in the near future? I don't. And I feel that when I take tours to the Holy Land, and usually the guides are always the guides are Palestinian, whether they be Christian or Muslim, Palestinian. But we'll see all the sites that you normally see and that people want to see related to faith. But you see it through a lens of the living stones, if you will, in those sites that are there for centuries and centuries. I have Palestinian friends who can trace their great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather having heard Peter, the apostle, preach at Pentecost. Okay? So they've been there, for so long. And but going and looking and visiting these sites and looking at it through their lenses and seeing the complications that exist, I think whoever, and regardless of one's faith, tradition, culture, background, as he said, kindness is the face of God on earth. And one has to look with generosity on the other and build on the image of God in the other, or however one wants to term that. And we're a long ways from that, in the Middle East. And the response of violence only begets violence. Yeah, there's an immediate thrill and an immediate kind of satisfaction that we did this. But it only, think about Gaza now. The horror of last October was terrible, of course, what happened. And no one negates that. But now you've got a populace that you've created among those little kids who have lost their parents and grandparents. You've created many, many more terrorists, or, as they would say, freedom fighters. So it's kind of depending on, what side of the thing. So it's really tragic right now. So we're a long ways from that in that regard.
Maybe we should believe more in the youth because we are taking over and we are fighting
Yeah.
very big.
Yeah,
and I think that our message, because we are your sons and daughters, and you guys taught us really good. I can say that what I'm hearing, and I am listening to everyone. I hear my mom and dad, and I come from the Middle East,
Yeah.
and yes, we are not as much as I want us to be, but we are powerful.
Mm-hmm.
We are strong.
Yeah.
And I think our message and our pain is going to speak louder than anything else.
Yeah. I think, and I would say, she's coming from Jordan, the Kingdom of Jordan. I have to say, some of the most all-embracing, tolerant, strong people I've ever met anywhere in the world happen to be from Jordan, and are among of course, Jordan is Palestinian and Bedouin, and but especially my experience has been a lot with Palestinians, and I remember hearing King Abdullah speak, and he gave it was about 2 or 3 years ago, and I was so taken by what he said, and I thought, oh my, if all of our leaders could speak like that, and with this greater vision of humanity, and so I resonate with what you're saying. Yes?
Has the prophet been translated into other languages?
Yeah, I think it's over 100 and some languages now. Yeah, so.
A follow-up question, how read is he in the Middle East?
How what? Read?
How read?
Yeah, a lot, but not so much for the prophet, because that was written in English and translated into Arabic. But so they mostly know him for all that he wrote prior to this first English book, The Madman, which were short novellas, short stories, and essays and articles. And so he's often known for other things than we in the West tend to be, or the rest of the world tends to know him for. It's a great question. Yeah. Anything else?
There's one more.
All right. Oh, one more. Let's see. Wow, you're going to love this one. And I, of course, know the answer. Do you know if Trump or Kamala have read The Prophet and have been influenced by Gibran? I will take a rain check on that.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful speech and a wonderful talk, wonderful question and answer session. I have a question for you. Is this a gift to our Tagore Center Foundation? Woo! Thanks again, a big one. This will, add to our gallery. Beautiful. And now, I think there has been champagne served to everyone, right? No? Oh, sure. Carlos, come on over.
First of all, my name is Carlos Duarte. I am the president of ALMA. We are building the first U.S. Latino museum here in Houston, and we are partnering with the Tagore Center. We believe that we are sister organizations, so we're proud to be here. We asked one of the most recognized artists here in Houston, Lisbeth, who has created these vases. She's behind the Frida Festival. You might have seen her. She's been awarded numerous times. And she's sorry that she could not be here, but she's actually been touched by the work of Gibran as well. So she put really a lot of her emotions into creating these vases. She would be honored if you would want to acquire some of these to take home. If you don't worry, I'll take them because they are beautiful. But it would be fantastic. But in all seriousness, we do believe that the only way that we are going to be able to overcome all of the challenges that we are facing as humanity in all over the world is if we embrace this universalist philosophy that the Tagore Center so beautifully is promoting. And my own personal experience with Gibran, I actually was inspired by the Jesús, el Hijo del Hombre, in the Spanish version of it. And the piece that you actually read was exactly the one that has been with me all the time, and it has been a guide for me. When I think of people, I always think of them as that which they will become through their lives. So seeing them as themselves, not as I would want them to be. So anyway, with all of that, hopefully you can acquire one of these beautiful vases. And again, really proud, Ruma. Thank you so much for this partnership.
Thank you.
So now Rumadi and Nandini would like to offer a token of appreciation and a word of thanks from Rumadi.
Thank God for being here today with you all.
And now I think there's been champagne served at all the tables, so if someone would like to propose a toast.
What you are doing, in some way, Max and I are business partners, we are not philosophers. We take action. How do we take action to solve the problem that that gentleman was talking about? Think about that, and Max will fund it. I'm serious, right? Yeah, do something right at the we can fund it in some meaningful way. Not we can talk and do all this. I was really surprised that Gibran is from a place where there's such a conflict. And he was in the center of that. And he got them to see his way. So why can't we do it today? And I asked you about China. You surprised me with saying Chinese people have bought most of the books. So cheers to you and cheers to everyone.
Cheers, everyone.